Barberi. I also go by Bar. And I'm a student here at UVM. I'm a student here at the Gunn Institute, as well as over at the school, Rubinstein School of Environment and Natural Resources. Very excited to be here. I'm brand new. This is my second week, so it's very exciting to see everybody here. And yeah, so it is my pleasure to introduce Jennie. And Jennie is an associate professor and a Blittersdorf professor of sustainability, science, and policy, with a joint appointment at RSENR, Rubinstein School of Environment and Natural Resources, and engineering. Her research, teaching, and community engagement focus on socio-political aspects of energy, technology, innovations, electricity system change, climate change communication, and facilitating social learning in the transition from fossil fuel to renewables-based energy systems, which is very exciting, as all of you are probably aware. But yeah, so personally I'm very excited because I work at the Office of Sustainability as well, especially for the Clean Energy Fund. So I'm excited to hear all about energy and clean energy systems. Jennie has a PhD and master's in environmental science and engineering from Caltech and a BA in environmental science and public policy from Harvard. She completed a postdoc at Harvard and was a faculty member at Clark before coming here to UVM. So I'd like to say welcome to Jennie, and also I believe Nancy can say a few words.
Yeah. Sure. Sounds good.
Say one more thing. I actually want to make an announcement that Jennie successfully made it through her promotion in tenure review and is a full-fledged tenure associate professor. So
thank you, Nancy, and thank you, Barb, for the introduction, and thanks to Deidre and Taylor for inviting me. This is a great opportunity for me because I'm brand new also, so it's great to have a chance to talk and introduce myself in this way. I guess I also wanted to say I tend to be very collaborative and transdisciplinary, so hopefully there are potential for connections with many of you. And I'm really, this position that I have, that I'm in now, really is designed to help be a catalyst and synergize connections among different places on campus and different kinds of work. So I really embrace that and open that as an open invitation to all of you to get in touch with me and talk about ideas and potential collaborations. I guess I will start by, I titled my talk, Power Struggles, Social Dimensions of Electricity System Change or Energy System Change. My approach really is qualitative social science research to help navigate a world of extreme complexity, radical uncertainty, increasing connectivity, unprecedented rates of change that we're seeing, and overwhelming unsustainability. I'll just say that out front in that we have this quest of we're trying to be sustainable, but really if you look at the macro trends globally, everything we're doing we're going the wrong direction. We're actually, for the most part, I'm sure there are examples, small-scale examples of improvements in sustainability, but in general, and part of that is this mantra of growth, right? We know that continued economic growth is unsustainable and impossible, right? Yet our society embraces that, and that's kind of what we assume is the way things are going to go. So there's a fundamental unsustainability about everything. So that's kind of a background. I just wanted to, Barb gave a nice introduction already, but I just want to give you a little bit bigger picture of who I am and where I come from and how I'm landed here. I was born in Ireland, and I have US EU dual citizenship. My family moved to the Boston area when I was 8. As was mentioned, I got an interdisciplinary undergraduate degree, a more technical PhD, a postdoc in policy, and then I was a faculty member for 9 years in environmental science and policy at Clark, and here I am at Vermont. It's an amazing opportunity to be a catalyst and make all these connections, and so I'm very excited to be here. What I wanted to do is is talk about the social dimensions of energy system transition. And what I mean by energy system transition is this transition from a fossil nuclear regime to a renewables-based regime. In some ways, I think we can all agree that it's inevitable that we have to move to that. I mean, that transition is going to happen. The question is how fast and how is it going to happen, right? And what can we do to facilitate or learn as that transition is happening? And so today what I'm going to talk about is cultural change and smart grid. And I also have a talk on Tuesday, September 16th at the School of Engineering that is about carbon capture and storage. I've done over a decade of work in carbon capture and storage. So I'm going to talk about kind of the social dimensions of coal and the politics associated with that on Tuesday. So I welcome any of you who are interested to come hear about that. So I won't talk about that today. But I'm going to focus on smart grid, and obviously here with the IGERT here at UVM, there's a lot of interest in smart grid, but my interests are really moving beyond technological and even economic analysis, thinking more critically about sustainability and resilience and the need for cultural shifts if we're serious about sustainability and resilience. I'm very interested in this contrast between radical versus incremental change, a relationship between, and centralization versus decentralization of energy systems. So I want to talk about some of the work I've already done, and then I want to end with kind of an introduction to some new research that I am in the process of developing that it takes advantage of the unique situation here in Vermont and compares the energy transition and gets into ideas of sustainable consumption in Vermont and Germany. And I'll talk about that at the end. So let me just back up and kind of talk about smart grid. And smart grid really, I consider an umbrella term for electricity system change. They're competing visions of what that is. It's a vision of system change. It's a very ambiguous term. Different actors have different interpretations of what that means. There are competing priorities. There are competing justifications for why change is needed. There's a big discrepancy in the degree to which people think it's a technological change or a social change or both. And the extent of change, and it's very complicated jurisdictionally, who controls the change and who benefits from the change. So some of the questions we've been asking in our research is, who controls and benefits from electricity system change? What are key differences in priorities and perspectives among different stakeholders? And what are opportunities for engaging and empowering people through electricity system change? And we have a forthcoming book on smart grid. And this research has been funded by the National Science Foundation Science, Technology, and Society program. So the linear view of electricity systems is that we have generation, transmission, distribution, and then we have the use of the electricity, right? The industrial service and residential sector. If the technological pieces of that include information and communication technology integration, it's basically just computerizing the grid so that we have better ways of monitoring and measuring and knowing what's going on. But also renewable energy integration, demand response, and price controls. Smart meters are a big piece, and that's the piece that interfaces with consumers most. And then other consumer interface tools so those are some of the technologies associated with smart grid. In terms of the actors involved in smart grid, you can think it's actually quite complicated. There's regional transmission organizations that organize and manage the whole regional system. Then there's the utilities, different kinds of utilities. Then there's the state and federal government gets involved in some things. And then industrial and commercial and residential consumers. So there are multiple actors who all have all are impacted by our electricity systems and any changes that happen. So our research really was a mixed methods approach. We did media analysis, we did focus groups, and policy and document analysis. And one of the things we were looking at, and we were applying this framework that we developed to assess perspectives on energy system change, on different factors that influence energy systems change. Conventionally, as I mentioned, most energy system work focuses on technical details, how does it work, and economics, how much is it going to cost. But there's a lot of other things that are very influential in determining system change. There are environmental considerations, there's regulatory and legal, there's political, who's supporting what and why, and sometimes it's not clear, what motivations people have. And then there's cultural change. Electricity and energy is so embedded in our everyday lives that there's huge cultural influences on how electricity and energy systems develop. So I'm just going to give a couple samples of some of the kind of results. In our media analysis, we looked at, this is just national level newspapers, when smart grid was mentioned, and there was really a peak after the Stimulus Act, where there was a big federal investment in smart grid technologies. A lot of smart meters were deployed during that time. And we applied our speed framework to assess in the media how was smart grid talked about in these newspaper articles. And there was definitely, this is the speed frames that I just mentioned, and then positives on the right and negatives on the left. Definitely a dominant focus on technical and economic details. But there was quite a bit of discussion of environmental benefits and cultural benefits. And when cultural benefits, what we mean there are kind of lifestyle implications, right? That people mention, things were mentioned in these newspaper articles that are benefits or negatives in terms of how people live and cultural details. Another aspect of what's happening with energy system change is that there are new societal expectations. In the past, the people who manage the electricity system, the utilities, the government regulators, have been very much focusing on reliability, make sure the power can stay on as often as possible, and affordability, keep it at the lowest cost as possible. But increasingly now, there are several other big expectations. Being efficiency, resilience, and being more able to weather kind of extreme weather events and try to prevent power outages and other kinds of disturbances. Security, there are issues of security, and obviously sustainability and the environmental impacts are now being integrated into our electricity system expectations. We did an extensive set of focus groups with, this is a big collaborative project, so I didn't personally do all these focus groups. We had a team of multiple graduate students from Massachusetts, Minnesota, and Texas doing these focus groups, where we went and talked to all of these different organizations, the regional transmission organizations, the regulatory agencies, the utilities, academics and technical experts, environmental groups, consumer groups in these 7 states, and asked them, what is smart grid to you? What are the benefits? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? And we got a breadth of different perspectives, as you might imagine. For some, smart grid is represented by the smart meters. The smart meters, because it's the interface with people and residents in particular, that's what is the most compelling or noteworthy for a lot of people. But there's a lot of controversy. There's concerns about privacy, health, and security concerns. And there's also this kind of cultural opposition that a lot of people don't actually trust government or big business that they have their best interest in mind. So there's kind of this mistrust that makes the smart meter rollout challenging in a lot of places. In California is where they did the most aggressive smart meter rollout early on, and some of those programs were really badly implemented, very little engagement with customers. They kind of come in and you have to use this, and people are like, what is this? Why do we do this? And how is this going to work? And what's the benefit to me? One of the things that's really interesting in our work is these kind of divergent priorities, and we kind of have a couple of spectrums that are pulled. That are really interesting here. One is this centralization versus decentralization. Smart grid could help to enhance centralization of the electricity system, or it could help to decentralization, or it could do both, right? It's not either or, but different people have different perspectives on which it should do. This kind of also, you can think of it as large scale, big wind farms and solar farms versus community-based generation and more local transmission and distribution, and then focus on community engagement and social changes. So that's kind of one dichotomy that we saw. Another is this incremental versus radical change, which is really interesting because some people think of the smart grid or any change as just a little tweak that's going to make everything just a little more efficient, but we don't really have to change anything, right? It's going to be, I mean, maybe we'll change some behind the scenes technology, but socially we don't have to change anything. Whereas others actually see smart grid as this potential for really radical shift in our electricity system that involves cultural change in our expectations in terms of size of our houses and mobility, and that could really change how we do things fundamentally. So there's this breadth of different perspectives, and within each of these you can kind of think about different quadrants and different perspectives within that. So the centralization-decentralization dichotomy is really among the kind of most interesting. And if you think about, and so what this means is decentralized systems are more household level renewables and community-oriented and community-engaged, community-supported generation and distribution. And it decentralizes control, and so it includes microgrids and locavolt, which is this term of people who are generating and using their own local energy. And centralized control, centralization has the potential for actually, if you think about scale and we need so much renewables to meet this demand, there's this, it's very easy, a lot of people envision these huge macro level renewable installations. But the thing with those is that a lot of the notions of enhanced centralization actually reinforce current institutional arrangements and limit the control to just a few people who have control, and it disempowers most people who don't have control and are kind of at the mercy of. And if you think about this, desert tech is one extreme example, and there's plans to supply Europe with all of its energy from solar farms in North Africa. And you can imagine there are all kinds of equity issues and concerns associated with that kind of a scheme. So one of the things we've done in our book manuscript is think about smart grid. We use this analogy of the blind man and the elephant, that depending on where you are and what piece of the electricity system you can touch or you have connection with, you see something very different than somebody else who is seeing a very different part. And so that's been a helpful way of thinking about what our research has actually offered. And what we hope is that by unearthing all these different perspectives, there's potential for aligning some of the priorities among different actors to facilitate change in the right, or in a direction that could be toward more sustainability and resilience. So the diversity of smart grid priorities and perspectives includes consumers really want low rates and reliability, and some consumers are very interested in environmental impact reduction. But among consumers, there's definitely a sense of limited influence on their energy systems. Governments, very complex and different in different places. The private sector obviously is interested in being accountable to shareholders. Environmental advocates obviously are interested in the low carbon shift and renewable integration and the critical piece that smart grid offers there. And energy system researchers, for the most part, are engineers and technical-oriented people, tend to assume minimal social change, and that most of it will be technical change that will make it so that we actually don't have to change the way we live. So some highlights of the smart grid work, and then I want to jump into kind of more looking forward, the kind of work that I want to be that I'm working toward. We found a definite narrow focus of engineers and economists in defining and controlling possibilities for change in the smart grid visions. Smart grid is so broad that there are multiple types of changes can be justified under this umbrella, which actually can be dangerous because some things they can say, oh, this smart grid, it's for the good overall, could be actually counter to goals of climate mitigation or climate change adaptation. Because as you can see, like if you think about centralization or and there's actually inflexibility when you centralize things, right? And so there are these complicated things that not everything that's termed smart grid, it is actually leading to what people might think of sustainability or resilience. There's these bifurcating perspectives on social change. Some view technological change as sustaining the current energy expectations, limiting the need for social change, whereas others envision radical social change in our energy consumption patterns. Overall, it seems clear to me at least that decentralization offers more flexibility, more modular systems, more adaptive, and also more locally appropriate. So in the decentralization versus centralization dichotomy, a tendency toward decentralization or opportunities for decentralization seem really important. And there are multiple opportunities for broader civic engagement and energy system change, including energy education outside of engineering. Energy studies really could become and should become more socially oriented, interdisciplinary, and heterogeneous in terms of who's thinking about energy. So that's kind of a quick overview of some of the work that I've been doing related to smart grid. What I want to do now is just introduce some ideas related to studying energy transition and sustainable consumption. And sustainable consumption is a really challenging notion, but I think it really is a leverage point. So I want to, and I'm interested in ideas and suggestions in this because I haven't yet actually done too much, and I'm still defining the research in this area. So the important thing to think about with the renewable energy transition, right? We said it's kind of inevitable. We're shifting from fossil fuels to renewables at some point, right? Because we know fossil fuels are limited. But the important thing to consider is that this renewable energy transition is not primarily a technological transition. We think of it as technology, right? We're going to switch our coal-fired power plants. We're going to maximize renewables. But it also requires major social and cultural change. If you look at all the estimates of how much land is needed to generate enough renewable energy to meet our current demand and our growing demand and growing population, it's impossible, right? So this shift also requires fundamental cultural and social change that we can't even yet, most of us don't even envision. It's really not part of the discourse, the dominant discourse. Most social science research on energy focuses on public acceptance of energy technologies, like how can we get people to understand and accept and not be opposed to the wind farms or the solar. And another whole set of research and important research is on incentivizing individual behavior change. The case has been made, and actually I saw a talk yesterday in Boston by John Sturman, who's a system dynamics expert at MIT, who wrote about cultural change to sustainable consumption, and he was making the case that cultural change involving lower expectations for consumption is the only hope for sustainable transition. There's no way, no technology, no other changes can be made that will actually get us to something really sustainable unless we change our assumptions for consumption. So the critical leverage point is really voluntary limits to consumption. This requires, we don't know how to do this, right? This requires some kinds of social movement, collective grassroots action. It requires, stop somehow halting this assumption of sustained growth, which we know is impossible. But this is a huge challenge because economic growth is fundamental ideology of our political and business leaders, and it's deeply culturally embedded. So we can't even talk about, it's hard to talk about not assuming economic growth, or growth in general. So, but that's essentially what needs to happen if we really want to talk about sustainability. So there's a need to end this quest for more income, more wealth, more consumption, unhealthy materialism. There's all of this work on people working more, and then they don't have time, so they have to, hire other people or get other gadgets to help them, and then that's expensive, so they have to work more, and all these feedback loops that end up, spiraling into a very high consumption, and so that's a real challenge. I want to introduce this organization called the Sustainable Consumption Research and Action Initiative, SCORI. I'm a member of this organization, and it's international. And it's a transdisciplinary group of scholars who are really focused on understanding complex driving forces underlying this consistent, this prevalent consumer lifestyles. And it has a focus on the wealthy parts of the globe. There's an energy transitions working group that I'm one of the main organizers of. And this genre of research obviously includes the happiness research, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And this is just an example showing US happiness and GDP over the past 40 years. The whole notion is that there's a threshold over which more wealth and more consumption doesn't increase happiness or human well-being. So a focus on this whole SCORI and the whole sustainable consumption emerging field is focused on human well-being as the goal rather than growth as the goal. And so I did just want to mention that when we talk about consumption, and this idea of sustainable consumption is very much oriented toward the affluent and privileged countries. It is not, obviously there are increasing numbers of people in the world who do not have access to basic enough food and access to electricity, and that is not what this is focused on. This is really focused on what some call overconsumption, right, of those of us living in places where we have a lot. I'm almost done, and then we can open up for discussion. But I wanted to just connect this with the work on energy system and energy transitions, because the conventional focus on technological innovation actually can end up distracting us from thinking about real cultural change. Technology innovation can give us a false sense of security, like, oh, well, now we know how to do this, so we don't really have to change what we're doing, now that we can generate electricity with renewables. Or whatever, different tweaks in the energy system. There's also the rebound effect associated with technology innovation or even management innovation. When we use less of something because of some innovation, we actually then oftentimes use that same resource in another way, consume it in another way. And then there's unintended consequences of technology, which are big. So the premise here is that as long as society is driven by sustained growth, technological fixes or technological advances are not going to help us actually get towards sustainability. So my ideas here are to think about, integrate. We have these two examples of two places in the world that have made a commitment toward this facilitating this renewable energy transition. Germany, being one, at the national level, has made a commitment that their government at the national level is committed to moving toward renewable energy. And here in Vermont, we have the Comprehensive Energy Plan, same thing by 2050, 90% renewables. And this demonstrates already the beginning of a destabilization of the fossil nuclear regime in these two places, and a resilience associated with this renewable commitment, right? There's some momentum there that's special, and it's not everywhere. And if you look at global trends, these two places are actually very unique. So the idea, what I'd like to do, and I'm collaborating with colleagues in social scientists in Germany who are funded to do social science on the energy transition, to explore the energy, how and if and to what degree is this consumption piece being addressed, going beyond public acceptance and other things, more conventional social science approaches that are technology oriented. So some of the potential research questions are: how are changes in energy consumption developing? Can we characterize emerging social movements toward reduced energy consumption in transportation, electricity, and heating? What kinds of interactions are there among the multi-level governance structures, national and state level, and collective grassroots and community action? And are there similarities, differences among the types of civic action on reducing energy consumption? Are there distinct things about Germany and Vermont that about like well-being as being more important than growth? These are some of the questions that could be interesting to explore. So I welcome ideas. This is not well developed yet, but this is where a direction that I'm going in, and it's an exciting area because I think it's an underappreciated but critical leverage point when we talk about energy transitions. So I want to acknowledge multiple funding and collaborators on various projects, and particularly I have two collaborators in Elizabeth Wilson, University of Minnesota, and Charlie Ray Peterson at Texas A&M and Swedish University of Agricultural Science. The three of us co-authored this book together. It's still in the process. It's not done yet. But it's been we've been working together for 6 years on various dimensions of energy system change and focusing on the social dimensions. I want to end with just letting you know and encouraging you to read this article. It came out in July this summer in Nature, and it calls for energy studies needs social science. If you look at it was a really interesting perspective in which it was a review of who's publishing, who's doing research on energy. And science and engineering disciplines are the dominate, dominate the disciplines. There's evaluation of social dimensions of energy systems. There's underrepresentation of women and minorities in energy studies. There's minimal integration of social science and humanities, yet we know this cultural piece is huge and there's so much potential there. And scientists and one of the conclusions of this paper is that scientists and engineers rarely collaborate with social scientists. I know there's some examples of where that isn't the case, but a lot of these articles I've written were very discipline specific. So this is looking at the peer-reviewed literature on energy. But I just want to end with that as kind of a welcoming point, right, for all of us to be broadening our vision of energy studies, that to get well beyond the technical details and the engineering logistics, and think more holistically about the critical space of energy in all of our lives. So thank you very much. I welcome new collaborative ideas. I think that I offer potential to provide input in connecting a lot of the quantitative work that is being done here at the GUND or in engineering with sociopolitical context and to enhance relevance and kind of bigger picture. I also have experience in communication of environmental research and modeling with non-academic stakeholders and facilitating those interactions, so I have potential there to engage with many of you. And the Energy Climate Transitions Research Team, which I'm calling my research group here, is recruiting PhD students. So if any of you have friends or family that or know of people who are interested in considering studying kind of the social dimensions of energy transitions and climate transitions, get in touch with me. Yeah, thank you.
So I think at this point we still have plenty of time for questions. So I guess I'll just open it up for questions.
So there's many sides, but two sides of the social thing is social change is a precursor to energy transition, and social change as a consequence. Which side do you see is maybe the biggest obstacle? For example, so technology changes but people don't. or people aren't ready for the technological change. There's sort of two sides to that social change connection.
Yeah. I guess I can see it more interconnected all the way, not as linear as that, right? Like, because which technological changes are even invested in depend on the social dimension, right? So they're integrally linked all the way along. So I think the big picture is that the emphasis tends to be on technological fixes, right? And so there's a gap in attention to the social dimension. And yeah, so I think it's both, and it's not quite as before or after. I think it needs to be attention to more social dimensions, both, all the way along. I don't know if that's a cop-out, yeah.
I'm wondering, where do you see the biggest drivers for that social change? Like, is it, policy? What level? Is it from, does it have to be within utilities or new structures?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the problem is that the existing incumbent actors who control the electricity system, have responsibilities day to day that they can't envision radical change, right? We talk to a lot of the utilities and the state regulators, and they need to be worried about keeping the power on now, right? And that's so there's a real disconnect, I guess, or potential for there isn't really space for some of these broader, bigger picture conversations and longer term thinking, right? So how this can happen is really hard. And some people would say, you're talking pie in the sky nonsense. Like, we're not going to have radical social change. But if we don't, really bad things have already started to happen, and they're going to happen more. And so at some point, we're going to hit limits, and we are going to be in very difficult situations where we have to make some changes. So that's where you could say what the kind of cultural shift that I'm talking about in terms of reducing expectations of consumption is unimaginable almost. But if you really want to talk about sustainability, you have to think about that. And I can't just pretend, that's not, because the reality is there's no way towards sustainability without thinking of that. I don't know how. The answer is I don't know how it's going to happen. It needs some innovative mechanisms. I think business is not going to, private sector isn't going to promote reduction in consumption, and the government in general won't either, because economic growth is what they're all about. But we have these two examples of governments in Germany and Vermont that have taken a progressive stance. The degree to which they realize, or people realize what that actually means, we don't know yet. But it's a big challenge. Yeah. Did I call on people, or you? Chris?
Thank you. That was great, and makes me really excited for a lot of the work you're doing, and maybe work we can even do together. But I just had a kind of an observation in engaging with some of particularly the policymakers in Vermont. There's such a short distance between the policymakers and all of the normal actors of the regulators and utilities, but also town energy committees and normal citizens that are trying to wrap their minds around this stuff. And so I think there's a really unique opportunity to engage with the incumbents and actually have them start to consider things like sustainable consumption and have that interact with some of the networks that are already established of citizen groups that are working in taking a lot of guidance from the kind of higher ups. But I don't really see a talk about consumption at all. And even with however progressive the government is here, they're trying to lean on very conventional policy tools that are going to tell very conventional stories about, like, if we get the price right, then everyone will act accordingly. If we set the regulatory standards in a certain way, then we'll act accordingly. And so I think it's awesome, just as a kudos to you, like, to try to tackle the social questions, because I think they're really not being discussed very much. This one suggestion would be, I think, is there's a lot of really neat ways we can acquire data at a pretty rich level in Vermont on the social side, getting to not only kind of your typical media sources, but tapping into a lot of these emergent networks that exist here. And I think that's something we should talk about later, probably with her too.
Jennie, I really enjoyed your talk. I'm so excited to see so many parallels in the things that you were talking about, some of the work that I'm doing, and really I have a question for you in terms of looking for models in other places to see where we've seen potential successes that might apply in certain ways. And I've often had some of my most trusted mentors suggest to me to look for the local foods movement in the way that consumption in particular is being changed. I'd love to hear your comments on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't mention that explicitly, but there is a local energy movement emerging that's similar to the local foods movement, and it hasn't caught on quite as much yet, but I think there's a lot of potential for that, and it's happening. But it's, you know, in some places more than others. Boulder, Colorado has been one example of that, because they've had a kind of big fight with their utility trying to get renewables in there and in their energy mix, and the XL Energy, the big utility, hasn't been providing it, and there's supposed to be a coal-fired power plant that feeds into Boulder, and they've been really strong in terms of local, that emphasis on local. But it's definitely emerging, and there's a lot of potential for that. I think it resonates with people in a similar way to the food movement, but it's not quite the same, because energy is a little bit more like either it's there or it's not. It's not the quality, and where, you know, people know that renewables, you know, they might prefer renewables than fossil generated energy, but it comes out the same, right? So it's not quite the same, but there are definitely some analogies. So yeah, thank you for that.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I don't know.
No.
Go ahead.
I
I was wondering what connections you can imagine with the K-12 educational system. We just adopted the new generation science standards here in Vermont, and wondering how you see that as a place to go through.
Yeah, so there's a lot of opportunities, and I just met actually a new faculty member here at UVM who, in the education department, who is interested in climate, energy, education, and K-12. So we should, he said we should connect and have lunch and figure out what. I haven't done a whole lot myself on K-12. I've done more about higher ed and changes in higher ed. But I've also done some work thinking about informal education outside of the formal system, and climate and energy literacy. And one really interesting thing about climate and energy literacy is there are actually national standards on both. Like, there's a whole climate literacy initiative, there's a whole energy literacy initiative, and if you read these documents, the energy literacy documents hardly mention climate change at all, and the climate documents hardly ever mention energy. And so I'm working with a colleague at MIT, and we're actually going to write a thought piece on that gap, right? Because they're so intricately linked and could actually help people understand these connections. You know, sometimes with the, you know, people think, oh, you should recycle because it's good for climate change. And people are like, how does that help? You know, like, it's not clear at all, some of these connections. And so there's a lot of opportunities for, but I don't know that. You know, I have ideas about K-12, but there's definitely opportunities to engage with that, for sure. Yeah. Either of you.
All right. Thank you. One thing I'm really excited about your work, to me also, because I'm skeptical that Vermont's plan, of course, is a goal. There's no policies yet supporting getting there. Right. And unlike Germany, so it seems one exciting thing that you and all of us can bring to this conversation a little bit is helping Vermont think about those hard choices that are actually going to have to be made if we really are going to move in this direction. And of course, the state has this big study out that outlines some of those. And, you know, it feels like your research is gonna help kind of spotlight some of how difficult or what it's gonna take to get there.
Good. Okay. And we'll come over here.
Okay,
Oh, and
go ahead.
All right, I was curious if you had any thoughts on the end game for the incumbents, the utility companies, especially in Vermont, that are supporting renewable energy, pushing towards net metering and all these things, and these profit-driven, to some degree, entities. Like, isn't the writing kind of on the wall that that is not a viable way of continuing business, and they're kind of at odds with each other?
yeah, absolutely. So the utilities, there's this whole death spiral, utility death spiral, all this attention given to utilities are going to be out of business. If we all have our own electricity, you know, locally generated on our roofs or in our communities, in a collective community system, they don't have a business model anymore, right? So they're very aware of that. I mean, I get this smart grid newsletter, which is the utilities that they're talking about it almost every day on these discussions. So, but they're, you know, things are slow to change, so they're keep going along with the current assumptions and then fight for maintaining, you know, people have solar to make sure they're still contributing to the distribution, just maintaining the distribution network, because they still do rely on the distribution network. So there's still a role for, obviously, for utilities. I don't know, the end game, you know, it depends how things go, right?
This is the vision.
And if you have more centralized systems, there's plenty of work for some of them, right? So it all depends how it goes. But yeah, excellent question there. So let's do here and then these three. Yeah.
Okay, so the technological side that you started to talk with, that's clearly energy sector specific. But then the kind of future actions, which was fascinating, seemed sometimes about energy and sometimes broadly about behavior. So are you saying we should work on reducing consumption of energy, or we should reduce consumption of everything, including energy? So how kind of broad-based is this cultural revolution?
Yeah.
And can we just tackle energy consumption without tackling the growth presumption broadly?
Great question too. I think the reality is that you have to tackle all of consumption. I mean, all of our products take energy to be produced and transported to us, and we, you know, there's energy embedded in and on food, right? Like how much energy does it take to get the food that's from a distance to come to us? So energy is so fundamental that I don't think you can really separate it out. It's not just about, you know, how many miles you drive, right? I mean, that's one dimension, or how big your house is and how much heating oil or natural gas you use. But it's bigger than that, and so I don't think you can really separate it out. I think that you have to, and I think this, you know, this vision of some kind of social movement, cultural revolutionary change, it will have to be so deep that it will influence all aspects of our lives. Yeah. So let's go here, and then both of you had questions, right?
Okay, two quick things. I should tell you that yesterday Burlington Electric closed the deal on the new hydro purchase of an old hydro plant in Winooski, to which we now say at Burlington Electric we are essentially 100% renewable. That involves Hydro-Quebec, wind on ridge lines, biomass, and hydro. There's some argument that can go on. In any case, it's happened here, doesn't mean it can happen everywhere. The question of Germany versus here, I was thinking if there's a rebound effect for resource use, isn't there a social rebound effect? I start taking longer showers, I let the thermostat go up, it's raining, so I won't take the bike today, I'll drive. And it seems like the Europeans use things like taxes to reinforce those things. So I'm just pointing out that it seems to me there's a European message here, which is, yes, we need a cultural change, but some signals coming down to reinforce that in the end are useful.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's the critique of kind of economic analysis and incentivizing things through, you know, financial means isn't to mean there's no value at all. And I think there's a lot with our tax structure and there's a lot of potential there. But a lot of it has to get beyond just our irrational economic decisions.
Sure.
Yeah.
I thought this was an excellent talk, and I was really struck by you're pointing to the complexity of decentralization versus centralization. I was reflecting on that, having come from a press conference on Tuesday, in which Green Mountain Power and NRG Energy Incorporated, which is one of the largest utilities in the country, their CEO flew into Vermont on Tuesday to announce this partnership between Green Mountain Power and NRG Systems to provide microgrid technology in the city of Rutland. And the articulation of why they're doing that was to provide increased local control, of course, also providing shareholder value.
Right.
Can you talk about
So,
that?
yeah, so obviously there are going to be opportunities for entrepreneurs in this. It's not to say, that there's going to be nobody making money on parts of the shift. There's some really interesting things, like I heard this example, Patagonia did this big, huge New York Times ad saying, don't buy this jacket, right? And it was very controversial internally in the company. Should we do this ad? But after they were saying, be careful about your consumption, be very conscious about, do you really need this? And we have high quality products. If you already have one, you don't need another one. That was kind of their message, because they've embraced that as a company. But after that ad went, their sales skyrocketed, right? So then they're all like, all right, this is working well, So there's these opportunities, for obviously entrepreneurial activity within this transition. But how and where and who is all.
Yeah, I hear that, but I guess I'm saying something slightly different, which is, here's a large multinational energy corporation coming into Vermont, going to the city of Rutland, saying, we're going to provide you with the technology to develop microgrid in your city so that you can have energy independence.
Right. So they have energy independence, but then they're paying this multinational company.
Right. That the provision of local energy certainly could, it's easy to imagine, I find it possible to imagine that the development of local energy infrastructure would be facilitated primarily by multinational energy corporations, not by community activists.
Yeah. I mean, many communities don't have the capacity, right, to come up with their own energy system. So absolutely, I mean, that's going to be that's a big piece. So that, again, there's, I don't have an answer.
No,
but it's a great observation. Yeah. Yeah.
Just maybe one observation from Germany.
Are you German?
I'm German, yeah. I have the feeling that sort of reducing energy is something almost that used to be culturally almost embedded in a lot of German culture. And my impression is that it really changed with the growth of renewables, since we have the enormous growth in renewables. I think people rather say, well, what do we have to care about reducing energy?
So that's the rebound or
backshift sort of
yeah.
thing. So I mean, there are policies from the European Union and in other countries that really want to tackle reducing energy, not just changing the systems. And in Germany, it's now the country that's basically blocking it. So I think, just from the analysis I absolutely shared with saying we need to reduce energy, not just transform it. And maybe it would be interesting to not only look at these two countries that sort of focus on renewable energies, but countries like Austria or Great Britain that say, or that implement policies to really reduce total consumption.
Yeah, no, that's great. And one of the things I didn't mention, but the focus on Germany and Vermont is also obviously to learn things that are relevant to other places, right? So definitely, and looking at other places and how things are happening in other places. One thing I did want to mention about Germany, the EU has a directive for smart meters. They want 95% or 90%, and Germany, despite their commitment to energy transition, they actually backed down from that and said, we don't think it's actually worth it to go out and put smart meters on every single person's home, because the marginal benefit of some of these users who hardly use any anyway is not worth it. So they actually didn't do the roll out 100% or whatever the high level. They did it more strategically. Let's put smart meters on the places where we know we can have a big effect, and not on the marginal or usage. So there is more. So it's an example of kind of a little bit more sophisticated strategizing, perhaps. But it was counter to kind of the EU-wide goal of getting smart meters in every home. So that's an interesting one.
I think we can take one more question. So.
Well, it was just at the beginning of your talk, you referred to a media analysis. How big was your sample size on that? You said how many percentage of that, but how prevalent was grid technology and grid articles in?
Yeah, I think if we had there were like 70 or 80 articles a year in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. So that was kind of on the order of, I think I had the numbers up there. So it wasn't, it's not huge, and it was US national level newspapers. And obviously, the thing with smart grid is that these are the numbers. So the total number at the peak, it's not a huge sample. And one of the things is that regional differences, if there's a particular controversy in a specific place, like in California, there would have been a lot more articles. We just did for this piece, this part of it, we only did national level. We have another.
So the New York Times you would separate out from the local news section to the national section?
Yeah, we assumed New York Times was kind of a national level newspaper. Obviously, it's both Wall Street Journal and New York Times are based in New York, but they have national level distribution. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you guys. Thank you, Jenny, and I hope that we see everybody next week, same time, same place.